Hello? We're going to go ahead and start with the question period, and I'm going to go back and forth between different speakers, so it's not the same person all the time, but we're going to start with a question for everyone. Is there much documentation about the interactions between Finns into Sweden and the Lenape, the impressions of each other, and whether it tracked any differently from interactions between Swedes and Lenape? Yeah, go ahead. It's on.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, this is a question I can't answer. This is just what I wanted to say, that I didn't speak about Finns today, but there is material that has been published. It's the acts of a conference that took place in '98, I think, the New Sweden conference. There is an amazing publication from this conference, and you find very interesting material about the Finns there.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with the primary source evidence about the Lenape and Finnish interactions in New Sweden, but I do remember off the top of my head in Bernard Bailyn's book, The Barbarous Years, he spends a bit of time discussing Lenape and Swedish relations. In particular, I guess their shared use of sweat lodges and sort of similar kind of cultural practices. So there is certainly evidence out there to be read.
This question is for Nicky. How did the Lenape's pre-colonial socio-political organization of small and autonomous negotiating group bands contributed to their ability to successfully negotiate with Swedish, Dutch, English with less violence than the more highly structured hierarchical Powhatan Haudenosaunee?
Ooh, that's a long, convoluted question. Very deep one, too. Well, let's take a step back for just a second. I want to just address that many of our people, at least down the ancestral lines, have noted that we considered white people or anybody from Europe Shawanaks, meaning salty people from the ocean. It doesn't necessarily reflect on anything more than the fact that they were all from a different land and that they came from the ocean, which is salty. As to why we may have been more successful at negotiating, even before Europeans got to the American continent, Turtle Island is what we call it, the Lenape were grandfather tribes. And as the grandfather tribe, that meant we were the oldest. And amongst the Shawnee and most of the northeastern tribes, they still consider us the grandfather tribe. And that is because of our negotiation skills. And we were often the go-betweens and translators between warring factions. So again, even before the Europeans got there, if there were two tribes or more involved in some serious violence, then we would go in and negotiate peace with them. Oftentimes that was with the wampum, and I think that those kind of ceremonial times of being able to kind of solidify it with wampum, it became ingrained in many of the interactions and the treaty making that took place. But I'm also curious to hear what the other panelists might have to say about this.
Okay, this one is for Mark. Did the exercise of authorities among the tribes, Minkwis versus Iroquois and Minkwis versus Lenape, for instance, change from 1500s to the late 1600s as a result of European influence?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is as I'm trying to mention in my talk, there's a much longer history of indigenous relations that totally shapes the way that these peoples relate to European colonizers when they arrive. Matterhorn's lifetime was greater than the presence of Europeans in North America in that period there. And consequently, the decisions that he made uh, in cooperation with other Lenape people were shaped by relationships that go deeper into the past, that extend to the Minkwe Susquehannocks, that extend to Iroquois country, that extend to Huron country, that extend even into the Wampanoag country in New England. Not to mention southward facing relationships, just as Nicky pointed out, right? This wheel of relations in all directions. So Lenape people in their world, in our way of talking about it in some ways, were central in a set of relationships. And consequently, whenever Europeans entered those spaces at every angle, except really from the West at this point, they alter those dynamics and have an impact on them. So there's this kind of constant domino effect of different things affecting each other, from Canada to the Chesapeake to Shawnees to New England. All of these things are tied together. And that's what I tried to emphasize in my talk. And they're tied together before the Europeans arrive and after the Europeans arrive. And that's the critical thing I wanted to emphasize.
Okay. Timothy, does the Little Ice Age particularly explain the lack of archaeological evidence of significant Lenape agricultural trade in the Delaware River Valley?
That's a good question. I'm not. The short answer, I guess, is just to mirror Mark's answer. The short answer is I'm not sure. We know that the Little Ice Age impacted indigenous agricultural practices across the continent. Of course, the details of those impacts are unfortunately mostly lost to us. Although off the top of my head, I mean, I think we can, despite any kind of impacts, we do have archaeological evidence of Lenape agricultural practices. And it's hard to say exactly how the kinds of climate impacts that we see in the Little Ice Age would have affected those. But we can certainly assume that there were climate impacts on Lenape agriculture during the period. Yeah.
So this question kind of goes along with that same one, and it's for Nicky. As the Lenape tell their history, significant agricultural trade was taking place. How was that particular story told, as there's little archaeological evidence that it took place?
It's actually just been passed down generation after generation. If we hadn't been doing it all along, you would not see the cultural activities that we do. Whether that's the bean dance or whether that's the green corn ceremonies, also called bread dances among the Shawnee. Those are all really symbolic and have been told to us that go way back thousands of years. The sweat lodge is another one, yes, that we talk about who we were and what we use certain things for. And in all of the cultural activities, it's just really hard to deny that there was continuous amount of agriculture going on. I mean, that's everything we do is about sustaining life. So I guess the question about, relying on archaeological evidence is that's a kind of frustrating one, actually, to be honest. I really trust anthropology and archaeology as much as I trust my people. And that's not to say that there's not some truth to it, but I also have realized as I've gotten older and grown in my studies that it's interesting to see how academia gets influenced with more evidence, whether that's linguistic evidence or whether that's some other kind of creative way of looking at what happened historically. And then new ideas and new information comes out of it. But I also want to encourage everyone to think about it through language. I use the Hopi, for instance, who have like 100 words for water. Why would that be so valuable? And what does that tell us? That tells us that the Hopi value water. Why do they value water? Because it nourishes their crops. That's what they're using. And it's also very scarce in their area. So in order to kind of commemorate that and understand what Lenape people were doing at that time, we really almost don't need to go any further than the language.
Agnès, please speak a little more about your process of identifying alternative interpretations of Lenape terms on Lindstrom's map.
Thank you for this question. So the idea is to study what has been produced since Johnson, and there a lot has been produced. And Nicky was mentioning the Lenape dictionary for, well, phonetics, for example, how you pronounce a name, a word. So there are a lot of sources that that need to be studied. And one of the difficulties, and this is what also revitalization projects leaders from the Lenape and other indigenous communities are confronted to, is the mass of information. So basically they're trying to create databases. The ideal solution would be to create databases of these vocabularies to try to cross different possible meanings, because it's such a detective work to follow the meaning of one word over the course of time. So yeah, it's a daunting task, but well, it's an exciting one too.
Timothy, you note a shift in the late 18th century away from a religious apparatus for interpreting changes in the environment towards scientific one. I was wondering, given the growth of evangelical movements at the same time, if you know any significant, sometimes continuities in terms of this religion ecology you are tracing in earlier periods.
Yeah, great question. There's definitely lots of continuities, although, as always, they're continuities with like significant caveats. There's a wonderful book called Church in the Wild by a scholar at Villanova named Brett Granger that outlines some of the late 18th and 19th century evangelical attitudes towards the natural world as a site or subject of religious interest. So there's certainly continuities in some regards, although there's quite a bit of changes as well. The kinds of Christianity that are practiced during the periods in question undergo quite a bit of change, and also some of the I guess why I mentioned science in there is some of the ways that religion can be used as kind of a technique for understanding changes in the environment in general undergo changes too, particularly as practices that had been quite popular, almost like unbelievably popular, alchemy, astrology, some of the kinds of magical techniques we see in almanacs. By the time we get to the middle of the 18th century, those kind of suddenly become no longer acceptable in respectable kind of intellectual circles. And so that's the real kind of like discontinuity, is the sudden, the fact that magic suddenly becomes impolite.
Mark, notwithstanding the translation into English, could you say something about the expressions used respectively by Johann Prince, wipe them out, and Matterhorn, root them out?
Okay, well, I don't have the Swedish text in front of me, and I don't recall the exact process of translation that I used for that, but you can find the original Swedish document at the Riksarkivet online now via the Swedish National Archives website, I believe. I have a copy of it somewhere. And yeah, Prince says something to the effect of wipe them out. I don't recall what it says exactly. I think the phrase was probably something like what we see in the Campanius dialogue, which is the verb utrota, to uproot. Um, and that term can literally mean uproot in the sense of uprooting a plant, which I think ties into some of the things we've been talking about today and in Nicky's talk and Timothy's talk as well as Agnes's. Um, but it also has the meaning of exterminate. And in fact, in English and in Dutch, you see similar words in the 17th century that have this dual meaning of uprooting or of something of that nature. And the implication is that it's a form of extermination or massive killing. So this is a popular metaphor across Northern European societies. And I think in the Campanius dialogue, it's important to recognize, which I don't explicitly mention in the talk, that this is his invention, right? This is not, he was not present. He was not invited to this Lenape meeting and sat there recording it. This is his attempt at imagining what a Lenape politics might have looked like. And to what extent it was real or not is up to anyone's judgment by reading the text itself. But anyway, the point is that this is Campanius's imaginary and imagined vision of what the Lenape people were considering. I do think that they were considering these things, and that's why I used that point. But it's Swedish translated into Lenape pidgin, retranslated back into Swedish. So we're multiple layers in terms of trying to think about the language here.
Agnes, as well as maps and Lenape word lists, are there any mentions of indigenous places names in diaries, account books, deeds, wills, or other contemporary documents?
Thank you. Yes, actually, contemporary documents, court records, deeds, land patents are the sources where we need to look for those toponyms, because they are they are used to describe the land and the landscape and the limits. Boundaries are expressed using, for example, this or that creek or this or that mountainous ridge. So this is how the indigenous people will describe their environment, their landscape. So this is really important to dig into this this type of documents.
Okay. Nicky, could you explain the role of war mothers?
Okay, the War Mothers are a more contemporary group of women, but they have roots in historical associations. So here in Oklahoma, there are 39 tribes. We were pretty much the dumping ground for the tribes to basically work it out in the first 30s, and then 1860s was the second removal era. And for many, many years, our warrior associations and our cultures that encourage that kind of activity, obviously, especially after the removal period, and with the plains, and we're not just talking about the eastern tribes now in Oklahoma, we're talking about the plains tribes in Oklahoma. So we're sharing and exchanging certain values and activities. The War Mothers was started by the Kiowa tribe, and they started what we call a chapter. And so that spread amongst most of the tribes in Oklahoma. I want to say 1960s and 70s, because it wasn't until 1978 that the Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. And so we could go back to legally being able to do our sweats, legally being able to do the kinds of activities such as stomp dancing all night. Um, and that may come as a surprise to most people. You'd have thought that the United States said religious freedom for everyone, and no, that's not what it really was. And as a way of supporting those warrior activities, those women, those older women, particularly who were moms of those who were sent off to World War II, what's it, Korea. Then, of course, we were in some of the other Vietnam and some of the smaller scale wars. And so the women, of course, as the life givers, if we're giving our sons to war, to battle for the United States, um, there's a significant bond that occurs with war mothers. You know, that's your baby out there fighting. And so that's what the War Mothers is about, is to support those young people, or those sons that are out there, and now daughters as well. So it used to be just the mothers. They've expanded it to anybody who is a relative, like mostly a direct relative. But you know, if you're close and you were raised by your auntie, I mean, that's just as significant. So I hope I've answered that one. I think it was probably a surprise to most people, and that's fine. There's a lot of exchanges here in Oklahoma that have taken place that we have shared with each other, and really have expanded some of our cultures in a direction that we were not even expecting.
Okay. Mark, at the beginning of your talk, you described a Native meeting about exterminating the Swedes. Why did they allow the Swede who recorded this meeting to attend?
Because they didn't. As I mentioned earlier, this is, again, a dialogue that's created for, you could say, educational purposes, didactic purposes by this Swedish priest. And it's relates to events that had been happening at that time. And some historians, actually, most historians who've written about this event have described it as if it's actually happened. And somehow it would passed on to the Swedish priest. I don't think that's especially likely to actually have happened. So my point is that this is still a kind of useful way of helping us think about this problem. And again, in this dialogue, I think it's invented. And this form of dialogue, you can find in similar examples. John Eliot, who was one of the famous missionaries to Indians in New England, he uses a dialogue. The dialogue is a common genre, you could say, in European writing from this era for purposes of teaching. And so clearly Campanius wanted to talk about these things and use that as a vehicle for his efforts to describe the native language. But then again, of course, to talk about the politics of trade and violence and how those things are tied together, and land.
This one's for you too, Mark. What do you think the basis of the friendship and the love the Lenape had for the Swedes was if they had taken land that wasn't given to them and didn't respect the right of the Lenape to sell the land to others like the Dutch?
So let me first say that when I use that term love, that was again from that dialogue. And so on the other hand, I do think when we are talking about politics and relations like this, we also shouldn't be afraid to use terms like love. I think we can sometimes think of political relationships as merely being about interest, merely being about power, merely being about ways in which people try to manipulate or abuse or exploit one another.
Agnès, should the reinterpretation of maps and indigenous landscapes from the 1680s change our image of William Penn as a friend of the indigenous?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Interestingly enough, I talked with Nanticoke Lenape people recently about William Penn, and I still respect William Penn very much. So they respected the fact that he learned their language, although this, of course, was also a way to avoid intermediaries in negotiations, although Penn did not stay very long at the time. They also appreciate the fact that he was interested in their culture, in their ceremonies, in their rituals. And I guess that compared to other settlers, his fair land policy towards them, maybe, well, not in comparison to the earlier 17th century, but to more contemporary practices, and especially what was happening also before and during in Virginia and New England, maybe by comparison, this is also something I'm curious to learn more about. Because I do think that he respected them, but he needed the money, and so he needed the land for, well, to create revenue for his colony, and the sheer acreage that he purchased from the Indians made it really difficult to keep the balance that was there before, and especially using this gridiron that completely changed the landscape and territory.
Okay, Nicky, did you want to answer that question as well?
Yeah, let me get back to the chat. So there was a question about sassafras, and so what does the Winagoki mean? Winagoki, let me say it that way. And so that means land where there's sassafras. So I wanted to answer that while I had the chance, but it sounds like you're also asking about how we viewed William Penn, and the only way I can answer it really is to think about last April, a year ago, we were at Pennsbury Manor. There was a group of all the federally recognized Lenape. We have strict boundaries when it comes to who we consider Lenape, and we were there reburying thousands of our ancestors' remains. And it was very moving. It was very just meaningful in so many ways. But the fact that we had to do it in the first place was another issue, right? I mean, yes, we needed to put them back, and we needed to put them back where they were closely to where they had been found and dug up. But at the same time, it was like, you know, why do we have to do this to begin with? And that comes from that erasure. It comes from the fact that colonization occurred at all. And while other state recognized, and that's a loose term, I don't believe in state recognition. What I do believe in is that the core of the Lenape people really still resent William Penn. Not that he wasn't close to a certain extent, but that's what started our people on a journey for thousands of miles from our homeland.
Okay, Timothy, although concerning a later period, what about Rittenhouse and the potential use of colonial indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, it is a bit of a later period, and I confess that the specifics with Rittenhouse I am not familiar with. whether or not there was any kind of indigenous environmental knowledge involved in his work. I do know that, again, sources from slightly earlier periods, figures like John and then William Bartram, Peter Collinson, some of those early naturalists who eventually became quite influential in the discovery of some plants that led to medical discoveries. The indigenous knowledge was a huge part of what they did. And so I don't know very much about any possible connections with Rittenhouse. There was definitely a ton of indigenous environmental knowledge that contributed directly to what became kind of the practice of science in early America.
Agnès, can you please cite the source of the map which showed Gunnar Ambo?
Sorry, which map are you talking about?
Just said it didn't say the map. They want to know the map.
Yeah, but I'm not sure which one is showing Gunnar Ambo. So maybe I'm confused. Can someone help me? Okay, so thank you. Oh yeah, right. Thank you. I got it. I was looking to the Swedish maps. Yeah, that's an anonymous map, but it was commanded by pen from John Thornton, who was at the time the main person on the London market of cartography and map makers and map publishing. So Penn knew that by commanding the map to be published by Thornton and Seller, who were the two people important on the London market at the time, the map would have a wide enough distribution, which, although I don't know that much about the circulation of that map afterwards, but the cartographers, the map makers were, map publishers were famous enough to ensure that. I don't know if that answers the question. The map is in Collection d'Anville, which is a very famous collection by a geographer, but it is also in other sources. It is, I think, in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania or Library Company. I think the Historical Society. Thank you.
Mark, to what extent did the Swedes and the Dutch differ in their interpretations or definitions of sovereignty and right to land in comparison to English definitions?
That's a good question. First, I would say that considering these questions in terms of nationality may not always be the most productive way to do it, in part because the claims often reflected the conditions on the ground and the actors who were involved in it. But I would say that from the very beginning, the Swedes, in their various guises, including a German Dutchman named Peter Minuit, made grand claims to the amount of land that they had purchased. And based on a long-standing European practice, the so-called doctrine of discovery, which still actually affects Supreme Court decisions in the United States today, which I'm sure Dr. Michael could tell us all about, European powers, whenever they claim to discover something, literally to uncover it in terms of as if it were hidden, and thus the uncovering was an action which gave them somehow property rights to this thing. Those property rights then were attached to sovereignty. And so essentially Europeans always had sovereignty in their own mind wherever they went. And it was just a matter of negotiating that sovereignty with other Europeans. And they used this practice called extinction of native right to, or extinguishment, to essentially declare that the natives, once they had sold land to Europeans, had given up not only the property rights, but also acknowledged that they were giving up their sovereignty as well. So all of these European actors, in one way or the other, use this doctrine to their advantage. And the question that of terms of variation was essentially in what sort of style they chose to do that, in which ways they chose to recognize native rights, and in what ways they didn't. So I would actually argue there's not much difference between the way that they did things. Some might have had grander claims than others, but in essence, they all practice the same kind of technique and ideology.
Okay, this is our last question for today, and it's for the whole group. Did the Susquehannocks have settlements on the Schuylkill, and if so, how far down?
I can pitch in this one here. This is a fascinating question. If you look at the Dutch maps from the classic Fingbones map, for example, of the early Delaware Valley, that's featured prominently on the cover of my book, by the way. It shows a list of native nations on it. And in the sidebar, there's a section in Dutch that describes the native nations of the Delaware Valley. And one of those nations listed there is identified as being Minkwas. One of those groups is attached or identified with the Minkwas. Likewise, if you look at earlier maps from the 1610s that the Dutch wrote about or presented, and if you look at early Dutch accounts of arriving at the Delaware River, the first recorded Dutch contact with native people on the Delaware River actually involves a meeting between Nederlanders, Dutch people, and Minkwas Susquehannock people. So the question of whether Minkwas Susquehannocks had occupations on the Delaware River or not is up in the air, I would say, in the sense that there are these European records that indicate some presence there. On the other hand, my guess is they didn't, judging from the kind of conflicts that we see from the 1610s onwards. But that doesn't mean that they weren't active, they didn't have an active presence on the river, and perhaps may even had small settlements there at different points. It probably kind of depended on the conditions at that moment. But it's an interesting question.
Okay, I know I said that was the last one, but Timothy, when is your book to be published?
Hopefully next year. Yeah, it's in production right now. Yeah.
Mark, did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to, in a sort of, how would you say, collegial way, put some pressure on Timothy's claims about climate change between the 17th and the 18th century. You can find many examples of people talking about the Delaware River frozen over in the 18th century. And of course, the story of the frozen Delaware features centrally in American mythology of the American Revolution, whether it's Washington crossing the Delaware to surprise some German soldiers on Christmas, or Valley Forge and frozen patriots just up the road from y'all, and so on. So I just wonder to what extent this claim that the weather has become milder and better for settlement, to what extent it might simply be a kind of ideological claim that comes along with the fact that they have taken up huge sections of the East Coast, transformed the landscape, and are seeking a kind of, I don't know, to show that the weather proves that they belong there in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, great points all around, Mark. There's no doubt that those later 18th century claims by people like Jefferson were 100% ideological. Alongside the doctrine of discovery, of course, was sort of the British notion that Native people did not actually have rights to land because they did not improve land, right? And so British colonists and other kinds of colonists have rights to land because they improve it, meaning because they develop it, they turn it into farmland. And we can sort of imagine these claims about changing weather patterns as part of that notion of improvement. Regarding the specifically the Delaware freezing over, I guess two things come to mind. First, I think the more significant part of that story to me, or at least the reason I include it, is the fact that there's this mention that Lenape people did not really have a memory of this happening before, right? So it's certainly an exceptional event. The other, I guess the other thing I would add there is, you know, we're all, and of course this isn't what you're doing, but we're all familiar with arguments that climates aren't changing because it's hot out now or it's cold out now. Weather isn't climate, and specific discrete events are less important to understanding climate change than long-term data, which we do have in abundance from the Little Ice Age. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Well, this ends our question and answer period. I'd like to thank you for coming. I